Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal, Canada for Reason to Resist on December 12th, 2024. On December 8th, fighters of HTS, a U.S. designated terrorist organization, seized the Syrian capital of Damascus. On that same day, Russia announced that Syria's former president, Bashar Al-Assad, had fled to Russia. Since then, Israel has bombed Syria relentlessly. It continues to do so today, December 12th. Its ground forces have penetrated further into Syria and to be moving from the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights toward Damascus. In addition, there's now fighting in the northeast of Syria between Turkish-backed forces and Kurdish forces. 100,000 Syrians are estimated to have been displaced internally by that fighting. Now here to discuss these developments with me is Matthew Hoh. Matthew had nearly 12 years of experience with the U.S. military and the wars overseas with the U.S. Marine Corps, Department of Defense, and State Department. He's the Associate Director of the Eisenhower Media Network and has been kind enough to join us for a second appearance on Reason to Resist. Thank you very much for joining me today, Matthew.
Thank you for having me back on, Dimitri.
So, Matthew, as far as I can tell, Syria's rebel forces are doing nothing to oppose Israel's land grab or stop its bombardment of Syria. On the contrary, 2 days before Damascus fell, a commander from the Free Syrian Army, a secular coalition of opposition forces founded by mainly Sunni defectors from the Syrian military, gave an interview to the Times of Israel. And according to the Times of Israel, the commander said the following: "We are open to friendship with everyone in the region, including Israel. We don't have enemies other than the Assad regime, Hezbollah, and Iran. What Israel did against Hezbollah in Lebanon helped us a great deal. Now we are taking care of the rest." So apparently, Matthew, these rebels want to make friends with Israel, which has illegally annexed Syrian land and is now bombing the country mercilessly. But they seem fully prepared to kill fellow Arabs and Muslims to seize power in Syria. They seem a lot more like proxies of Israel and the United States than defenders of the Syrian nation. What's your take on the objectives of this organization?
Again, thank you for having me back on. And, it's simply, I think, to explain the relationship between those who have taken Damascus and those in Tel Aviv. It's simple. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And this idea that through chessboard style politics, Machiavellian scheming, channeling, having calling, the ghosts of Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, somehow these people are going to be able to align themselves into a position where they will be able to achieve their interests while using those who are also pursuing their own interests. So I think this idea is that, broadly, the idea is Israelis are going to control what they want. The HTS forces have seized the Syrian government, are going to control what they want. This is going to be mutually beneficial because they will both be against Hezbollah, both be against Iran. This, of course, excites the Americans because everything from the United States comes into the region with a pro-Israel and anti-Iran lens. Everything else is secondary to that. And then, of course, the role of Turkey and the Gulf monarchies. And so you see everybody involved in Syria right now, including the factions that are in power, whose interests are expressed in terms of anything other than actual support for the Syrian people.
But now that Assad has fled and resigned, do you think it's realistically possible that Iran and Hezbollah, one or both, would attempt militarily to intervene in what is happening in Syria? I mean, does it make sense for these rebels to remain allied, even if only for practical purposes, with Israel and the United States, given that the Assad regime is now definitively fallen?
Yeah, it's a good question, Dimitri, in a sense of how Iran, Hezbollah act. What could they actually accomplish at this point? I think everyone is waiting for the dust to settle to see what the clear lines in the ground are of who holds what. I mean, because certainly, I've been traveling this week, so if I'm behind on some things, please let me know. But certainly you still have the coastline of Syria controlled by former Syrian government forces. I'm not sure what we're even calling those people right now. I guess we'll call them former Syrian government forces, along with their Russian allies. So you have parts of Syria that are still under the control of the previous government. That could be a place where, if there was an effective effective coalescence or reestablishment of the Syrian government to then push out of there, utilizing the same type of forces that we saw used so effectively against these jihadist forces, and now not just the Western forces, the Al-Nusra HTS forces, but also to the Islamic State forces. These were very successful in their military operations, 7, 8, 9 years ago. There's no reason why that can't be reestablished, of course, for a number of caveats. Russia's at war in Ukraine. Iran has issues in terms of being checked by Israel and constantly having to look for an attack by the United States and others, and certainly the role of Turkey in all this, which we really haven't even addressed. The Turks, who seem to be gaining from this almost as much as the Israelis in terms of their effort, their ability to take ground from the Kurds, weaken the Kurds, and the overall puppet master type aspects of the Turkish involvement in this, with whether it's with the HTS factions or the Syrian National Army factions. So again, we keep coming back to this, and we're forced into this type of chessboard, real life game of Risk type analysis and understanding, because that's how the players involved see it. And, I'll say it again because I think it's important. Nobody in this seems to have a concern for the Syrian people. And where this goes, I don't know of anybody who predicted that this would happen. Certainly this was planned. It was prepared for. Various powers were involved in ensuring the success of this, whether it was direct or indirect. But where this goes, we still don't know. And so I think the congratulations, the backslapping, the toasts that are occurring in Tel Aviv, occurring in Washington, D.C., occurring in Ankara, other places, may be very well short-sighted or temporary, because, history will tell us these types of things don't work out the way everyone thinks they're going to.
Yeah, on that note, I wanted to ask you a question about HTS. In November 2022, about 2 years ago, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is an arm of the U.S. government, issued a report on HTS. And it stated in that report about the conduct of HTS in the area of Idlib the following, quote, in 2021 and 2022, HTS has continued to perpetrate some of the same human rights abuses, including torture, forced disappearance, rape, and other sexual violence, and killing in detention, that the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria documented for the organization and its predecessors through 2020, close quote. So we seem to be hearing from the corporate media and some political figures in the West that HTS has undergone some kind of a transformation and has evolved into an inclusive organization that is going to prioritize the rights and interests of all Syrians, regardless of their religion or ethnicity or gender. Do you think this is a credible claim, Matthew, based upon what you know?
No, absolutely not, Dimitri. And I think you and many others, we've seen that in the last 2 weeks, essentially. The playbook, the script, the plans, whatever you want to call it, were taken off the shelf and dusted off from where they have been placed, 7 years ago or so. I have not heard the term moderate rebels like we were hearing 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago to describe these jihadists and Islamists and extreme reactionary forces. But I have heard things such as, I think the one that makes me laugh the most, even though it's a very tragic and dark humor to it, is this idea that HTS practices a constrained jihadism. So right, like you're seeing, and it's amazing though how quick. This shows you how well prepared this was, and how while certainly it probably went better than anybody in Israel, the U.S. or Turkey expected, or the Gulf states expected, that there were preparations here, because you saw with the media rollout of this, the Western media didn't seem to be caught flat-footed. I think everybody was how quickly HTS advanced. Certainly, I went to bed. I was over in Europe, and I went to bed, and HTS was outside of Homs, and when I woke up in the morning, Assad had fled. I mean, so it did go very quickly. But the speed at which the media kept up with it, and the media had interviews prepared, and they had these talking points, as well as, too, what you come to expect. Israel is not bombing Syria, and they bombed, as at time of recording, almost 500 times in the last 3 or 4 days. They bombed Syria, plus all the years of bombing before that, as well as seize substantial ground to the east of the Golan Heights. Again, clear, as you said earlier, clear violation of international law. But the way it's described here in the U.S., if we were to turn on the cable media, if we were to open up the big corporate newspapers, the Journal, the Post, the New York Times, Israel is conducting these bombings not because it's some part of plan or there's some desire on Israel's part to seize territory and gain territory, which there is, because they say it out loud. I mean, they say it quite openly and clearly, particularly those in the extreme right, the religious reactionaries in Israel, those who really do believe in the idea of a greater Israel, that Israel's boundaries should extend to Damascus. Actually, you all know this as well. There are those who say the boundaries of Israel should go from the Nile to the Euphrates. They've got patches some of the IDF soldiers wear saying that, essentially. But anyway, it's clear that this is part of, if not a written down plan by the Israelis, something that certainly goes along with their best interests and what they'd like to see happen. But in the U.S., it's described Israel's attacking Syria because it's a power vacuum. Right. So you have these very convenient terms that get brought up, these very convenient tropes and narratives. Some we've seen before with Syria, others with really any conflict, to explain what's happening there. It's a power vacuum, and so I think that's what we're going to be up against, as well, is that the same people, the same personas we saw on CNN, quoted in the Washington Post, amplified on Twitter, these people are back again. And the desire to defeat the Assad government, to take Syria for our own, I mean, the collective West under the American empire, and to color Syria on the map our color, has never gone away. And again, it's not about Syria. It's about Israel and Iran, and the Syrian people are the ones who suffer for it.
So I want to talk specifically about the refugees, the Syrian refugees. As of 2024, the UN reported at least 7.4 million Syrians remained internally displaced, and approximately 4.9 million were seeking refuge in neighboring countries, mostly Turkey. And an additional 1.3 million have resettled elsewhere, mostly in Europe. And the countries currently, the top 3 countries in terms of registered Syrian refugees are Turkey with 3.1 million, Lebanon with nearly 800,000, and Germany with a few more than 700,000. And this week, Austria's government stopped all asylum claims from Syrians and says it's making plans to repatriate or deport back to their homeland these Syrian refugees, arguing that the situation in the country has changed fundamentally. Germany, home to 1 million Syrians, about 800,000. The UK, France, and Greece have all said that they too will halt asylum decisions for now. Given the current conditions on the ground, Matthew, do you think that this is a sensible and humane approach? Is there any realistic prospect, given the current conditions on the ground, that these people can be returned to their homeland safely?
No, there's not. And it gives me a chance to more fully answer your question, because I kind of went off on a tangent on the last answer. This idea that HTS and the others that have taken power are somehow going to be unlike how they were before, right? The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. We all know this. And certainly, though the Western public relation teams from USAID and from the Brits, their version, et cetera, have come in and they've tried to make up those who've taken power in Syria as somehow more moderate, somehow more compassionate, somehow more pragmatic. These are all the terms we've heard to describe their jihadism. It's just simply isn't the case. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. I'm sure they're on their best behavior for these couple of weeks as the cameras are there. But then, what the West will do, as the West always does, it will shine its light where it wants to shine its light and not fully tell the story of what's occurring. So the idea that somehow people who are in an asylum status throughout the world, who are being protected from returning from Syria because of the very real danger that these groups pose to them because they are religious minorities, because of sectarian differences, what have you. There's nothing, I think, anyone who's being honest and having a good perspective on this can point to say, look, yeah, no, it's okay for them to go back. One of the things I think that's interesting in the coverage of this is how little it's talked about what Idlib is like, where these groups came out of. I've seen very little conversation about, well, what it's been like underneath the rule of what's called the Salvation Government, what it's been like underneath the rule of HTS. And what you've heard, it's pragmatic. They got the water, the buses are running on time, water is working. Well, some of that's because the Turks are able to provide for them. You have to remember that the remainder of Syria has been under U.S. sanctions, crippling, deadly sanctions for years now. And so while I think it's dangerous for people to return to Syria, particularly if they are from ethnic or religious minorities or have any type of difference with the prevailing ideology and world outlook of HTS, I think the other side of it is that we likely will see a relaxing or ending of the U.S. sanctions on whoever's in power in Damascus, that this will be the way for the U.S. to prop up this government and promote that hedge against Iran. So the idea with the sanctions called the Caesar sanctions for years now has been to starve the Syrian people, prevent their ability to rebuild their country, in the hope that eventually something like this will happen, that the government will collapse. You can see that the 1-2 tandem in that, right? Continue to starve them and then have them hosted up in Idlib, essentially, propped up and backed by the Turks, armed, preparing, training for this eventuality, and it worked out very well. I mean, that's one thing I think that those of us who are not aligned with the interests at play here, who are not aligned with the governments who are carrying out these policies, really have to look at how essentially effective they have been this last year. I mean, look how effective Israel has been in terms of degrading, reducing, destroying the Palestinian resistance. I mean, I think everyone knows what I mean. They're not certainly not destroyed, but certainly their ability to carry out attacks is much more limited. Israel's actions against Hezbollah in Lebanon, particularly getting Hezbollah to agree to a ceasefire, which takes Hezbollah out of that war. And now you see right after this, the destruction of the Assad government in Damascus. I mean, so effectively, Israel and the United States looking at the axis of resistance, along with the Turks and the Gulf monarchies, looking at the axis of resistance and taking it apart one by one. And it's very simple. This idea that they are allied, they are an axis because they are stronger together, like the fist, right? Don't take on the fist, take on it one finger at a time. And so that's something we really have to contemplate and really understand is how effective they have been in terms of strategically isolating the axis of resistance, and be interested to see what they do next in terms of course, they're going to need to solidify and shore up their gains in Syria. But then, of course, what do they do next to further isolate Iran, further isolate the Yemenis? What are they going to do about Iraq? I think it's a little easier because, of course, the United States owns the Iraqi foreign currency reserves. We essentially own their money, or we possess their money. So I think we control the Iraqis in that way. The Americans control the Iraqis in that way. But certainly this is playing out as a great game that, we've seen the likes of before. And of course, the dangers are where this goes to.
Yeah, Matthew, even if they were to completely lift the sanctions at this stage swiftly, which, I see no indication they're going to do it swiftly, yeah, but let's assume they do. You have no effective national government. Whatever government there was has been eviscerated. Very questionable whether they're going to be able to establish a stable government and a competent government in the reasonably near future. The country could descend into sectarian violence. And there is tremendous damage being done as we speak to the infrastructure of Syria, what remains of the infrastructure, so that even if the U.S. government lifted sanctions swiftly in other Western states, it would be a long time before people could go back to Syria, potentially, and have any prospect of any kind of decent, secure life. And it seems to me that the Turks may have bought themselves a massive headache. We could see an actual increase in the outflows of,
Right.
well, depending on how things transpire. And I was in the Aegean in 2015 to cover the last major migrant crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that nearly destabilized the European Union.
Right.
That's
Right.
how serious things. I mean, isn't that a possible scenario here that we actually see more people fleeing Syria, a revival of that migrant crisis we saw back in 2015, and all of the resulting tensions within the European Union around the free movement of goods and people?
Right. Certainly. I agree. I think with any relaxing of the sanctions or removal of sanctions are done for the purpose of keeping the proxy government, the client government, the allied government, how you want to describe it, in power, not to help the people, not to rebuild the country, but giving them the tools, the assets, the resources needed for them to maintain power in the same way that was done to try and remove Assad and his government. All what you said is very true. It's certainly where this can go to, what it will look like. We can only look back. And as you were saying before, what we've seen already. I think, again, it comes back to this idea that they simply, when I say this is the Americans, the Brits to extent, and the Israelis simply don't care. It's not their concern. The fate of the Syrian people it doesn't even come up on the list. And in terms of the migrant crisis, say, what will this do to Europe? Will this put Europe back to where it was, say, in 2015, 2016? That's not their concern. Europe, for a long time, for the American empire, like other parts of the world, has simply been a buffer zone, right? So the consequences of your actions overseas are absorbed by these buffers. And Europe is a great buffer. So you can have your wars all throughout the Middle East. You can have tens of millions of refugees coming from, greater Middle East. So refugees coming from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, wherever, Somalia, wherever. And they will end up in Europe. They're not coming to the United States. I mean, you could look at it in the sense of war with Russia. The belief in the United States still, even though the Russians have warned the U.S. off of this, is that if it escalates to the point where it actually is a NATO versus Russia war, conventional or nuclear, it's going to take place in Europe. We're going to be okay. We've got this great buffer. It's not the oceans that protect us. It's the client states, the vassal states of the empire that do as well. That's one of the reasons why empires have states such as that, right? So, the idea that this would be a concern for those in D.C. and certainly in Tel Aviv, they're not going to be going to Israel, is and if anything, I think if they think about it, those in power, in terms of what do they get out of it, they tend to see more right-wing governments come into play. They said that they tend to see more hawkish views towards the Middle East. That the result of the refugee crisis in those countries was, to a large degree, not, well, what's the cause of this? Maybe we shouldn't be helping. Maybe we shouldn't be taking part. Maybe we shouldn't be supporting these American wars in the Middle East that have created this refugee crisis. Maybe we should be thinking about the causes of this refugee crisis. But what you see, of course, you see the reaction to it, often right-wing reaction, isolationist, the rhetoric, but also, too, a national security fixation on the Middle East that gets strengthened by popular support for anti-immigrant, anti-migrant action that somehow speaks in a way that you end up doubling down or reinforcing the very policies that are creating this refugee crisis that you're experiencing.
Right. Let's talk now about Hezbollah and Iran. HTS's seizure of Damascus has effectively cut off the flow of weapons through Syria from Iran to Lebanon. And at the same time, it's not clear that Hezbollah's missile arsenal has been exhausted. Presumably, they continue to have some kind of an arsenal at their disposal. And I'd also imagine that they have some capacity to produce some of their weapons locally, although probably not the more sophisticated missiles in their arsenal. Nonetheless, now that Hezbollah seems incapable of obtaining additional weapons through Syria, what do you think Israel will do in South Lebanon? Do you expect it to resume its attempts to capture South Lebanon? And if so, do you think that's likely to fare well?
No, I don't think so. I don't think the Israelis have an interest in control, although there certainly are segments of Israeli society and military circles and political circles and Zionist circles that believe in taking land in Lebanon. Just as they believe Greater Israel goes to Damascus, they believe it goes up through Beirut as well, right? So particularly that southern part of Lebanon, south of the Litani River, has long been for decades now in discussions within Israeli circles, the idea that we have to have that. We have to take that, whether it's for national security, militarist type of we need a buffer zone, or it's the more ideological Zionist, this is part of the land that we need to take to fulfill our obligations. So I don't think they're interested right now in doing that. I think their interests are, for the Israelis, I'm a big believer, Dimitri, that you always go back to what are the priorities? What are the people, we tend to want to put all these things in a box, separate boxes, that with the Americans, when they look at the Middle East, they put Syria in its own Syria box, and they put Lebanon in its own Lebanon box. And there's, of course, cross-contamination, or they touch on one another, but that they think clearly in an isolated view of this country, and they rule out all the other noise around it, and they view it very, very specifically. And that's not the case. It's essentially the same group of people making these decisions over and over again. And they come out of a culture, they come out of a mindset, they come out of an imperialist worldview that we call in the United States the blob. And so, of course, anything in the Middle East is dictated by concerns for Israel and and about Iran. And so I think with the Israelis, it's the same thing, too. Their priority is Palestine. Their priority is the Palestinians. So the way they look at all of this, and Israelis will say their biggest concern, their biggest threat, their biggest issue is Iran. They say that because that's what the Americans like to hear. And it also distracts from what their biggest concern, their biggest interest, their biggest threat, if you will, is the Palestinians. And they don't want to talk about that. Right. And so I think with what we're seeing with Lebanon and Hezbollah, this ceasefire, the mass destruction in Lebanon, the killing of Nasrallah and many Hezbollah leaders, the way that this played out in the Israeli media, the way it played out over several months, made it very politically popular that Netanyahu and his government are in a better place than they were 4 months ago. And they're happy with that. They achieved that. They got the polling number boost that they are looking for. They also got Hezbollah taken out of the conflict. They no longer have that pressure on the north that they once had, which caused domestic political concerns. Essentially, hey, how come the government's not doing anything to get our people back into northern Israel? We've got 75,000 Israeli settlers living in hotels in Tel Aviv or wherever. This is an absolute failure on the Israeli government's part. The overextension, the exhaustion of the Israeli military, although we're seeing them put them right into Syria, so that kind of negates that a bit. But I think essentially what the Israelis want in Israel is what they have right now. Hezbollah taken out of the situation, not permanently, but at least temporarily, and they hope they can continue to extend that. They can attack Lebanon at will. I think their idea with southern Lebanon was to depopulate it, limit people back in, make parts of it uninhabitable, which they did. And then essentially, I think the Israelis going forward will view southern Lebanon as a free fire zone. That their drones and their attack aircraft will be in the skies, that they will have their intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, and that they will attack as they want. Mainly because that's what they like to do, maybe because that's who they are, but also too, it's politically good to be for domestic politics. It's good for Israel to be striking into Lebanon. The Israelis really like it, to put it quite simply. Yeah. So I think going forward, that's what we're looking at, Dimitri, is a continuation of the same this kind of establishment as a quasi free fire zone of southern Lebanon, trying to keep Hezbollah out of putting pressure, doing anything it can to put pressure on Israel in support of the Palestinians, and this now allowing Israel to focus consolidating its gains with Syria, figuring out what's happening with that. We're figuring out what's happening with that, and then moving forward, continuing to check the Iranians, eventually do something about the Yemenis, and then essentially declare victory. I mean, of course, the big thing for them, of course, is their finalization of their efforts in Gaza. In North Gaza, we see that phase. I see that phase as essentially now we're moving into the concentration camp and money-making phase. So as they continue to try and get people out of northern Gaza, south of the Netzarim corridor, the few 100,000 that are still left up there, whatever the number is now, continually trying to push them out, starve them, immiserate them, kill them, make it so it's impossible to stay there. Those who do remain will be in those concentration camps that are run by mercenary and contractor groups, as we've seen plenty of media reports about now. So there you see the money making and resettlement. I mean, it seems clear to me that, the settlers are going back in. Daniela Weiss, unless something has occurred in the last week or two, she says she's got a list. Daniela Weiss, one of the more prominent settlers in Israel, says she's got a list of 750 families who want to go into Gaza. And in southern Gaza, I think essentially the Israelis, Dimitri, are going to worry about that later. Push everyone down there, continue to immiserate them. The winter's going to be awful again. They'll die and they'll get sick, exposure, etc. We'll continue to kill them as we want, continue to destroy anything that resembles any type of infrastructure, continue to do everything we can to take away whatever hope they have. And eventually something will work out. I don't think the Israelis have that figured out yet, but the hope is that Egypt will let them in, Jordan will let them in, all the same stuff. Cruise ships, ocean liners will show up and take them all away and take them to South America or something. I think that's what the Israeli vision is right now. And of course, then annexation of the West Bank.
So despite the horrors, which you've just detailed and we've all witnessed over the last 14 months in Gaza, the resistance continues to fight, albeit at a degraded level. Hezbollah, I think you'll agree, despite the fact it has stopped fighting, even though the genocide in Gaza is ongoing, remains a fairly potent force, certainly enough to deter Israel from the time being to try another invasion of South Lebanon. You have Ansar Allah in Yemen and the Iraqi militias continuing to fire drones and missiles at Israel. And of course, Iran retains that formidable missile capacity, which it put on display two occasions now. They can clearly penetrate Israel's air defenses and strike military targets in Israel. So a lot of people I'm hearing, Matthew, say that the fall of Assad's government is a fatal blow to the axis of resistance. I'm not so sure. It seems to me certainly it's a blow, and this is going to be particularly problematic for the Islamic resistance. But in your opinion, how important was Assad's government to the axis of resistance? We're starting to hear complaints from other members of the axis of resistance. Maybe this is historical revisionism, or maybe they were always unhappy with Assad, and they just kept their mouths shut so that he would allow the flow of weapons to Hezbollah from Iran. But they're starting to say things like, he wasn't a true friend. He was moving towards the Gulf states. He never did anything he never actually engaged his forces to defend the Palestinian people or try to retake the Golan Heights. So in your estimation, how bad a blow is the fall of his government to the axis of resistance in reality?
It certainly is a blow. I mean, certainly in terms of public information, propaganda, et cetera, it's a blow. It's a victory for the Turks, Israel, for the U.S., the West, whoever. I haven't seen the memes. I'm sure they're out there of, scratching off one more member of the axis of resistance, whoever it is, Netanyahu or whoever with a big Sharpie. The idea, Iran will find another way to reinforce Hezbollah in Lebanon. And everything I just said about Israel and Lebanon, that's time limited, right? That's, certainly Israel would like to see that permanently, but the best they've got is temporary with that. As you've been saying, Hezbollah still maintains an enormous capacity. They took some real blows in terms of their command and control, their leadership. They were shaking up. You have to assign credit where credit is due and note how effective the Israelis were at that. The wisdom, I think, and this is where you have an issue where you have competing interests. And so while some people will say, look, Hezbollah has backed out of their support for the Palestinians. They've let the Palestinians down. They've betrayed the Palestinians. You'll hear that, right? And there's an argument to be had with that, right? But there's also the argument to have, like, where was it going for them? Where's the wisdom in continuing to slug it out with Israel, having your people be killed for something that you don't have any strategic attainment of, where you're not going to get a victory out of this? Why continue with, why reinforce failure, if you will? I don't want to describe it as failure, but why reinforce something that isn't going to give you the outcome you're looking for? And I think that's essentially what the Iranians looked at as well. Why get into this battle? Why get into this essentially maybe a regional war with Israel and the United States? For what purposes? We're still not going to affect what happens to the Palestinians, and we're going to have our cities destroyed, our infrastructure destroyed, and then what? So I think the willingness of the acts of resistance to do what's called a strategic pause, if you will, to hold back and, okay, let's figure out another approach here. I'd like to give them that credit. Maybe I'm being too generous with that. But the loss of the Assad government certainly is, unless this connection of Iran, Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah, and Lebanon to the Palestinians is something that is fabricated and made up and completely overblown. This is a big loss of a key link. And I've seen too, Dimitri, the commentary in the last few days. I was reading some on the plane yesterday about it as well, that Assad had been shifting to the Arab League. People were really unhappy about this. It was all a matter of time. And people are, you come across those who said, I said this in 2020 with the Astana agreement, this was going to happen. I don't know if they did, what I mean? But, certainly this is a blow, though. And it's a blow also to Russia. I was thinking in the sense of, for the Russians, this is similar to what the Americans went through in 2021. Although the Russians still hold on to their port in Syria, this is similar to the American experience in Afghanistan. Not the same by any means, but you can see the outlines of it there and what this means for the Russians and what they must be saying in Moscow about this. I think it's certainly the loss of the Syrian government for the acts of resistance and the victory in the minds of those in Tel Aviv and in Washington, D.C. going forward. They feel that they're unstoppable. And for those coming into the Trump administration, they are really buoyed by this. They really see this as a validation of American imperialism, American policy in the region, that we just have to apply pressure. We have to let our allies do what they want. So we have to let the Israelis do what they want. We have to let the Turks do what they want. They know what's best. We just have to support them. And the reason why it didn't work in the first place 10 years ago was because we got too involved. We put too many restrictions on them. We didn't give them everything they need. We hear this over and over again. This is why the Ukrainians aren't winning against Russia, because we're not giving them everything they need. And I think that's the wrong lesson to be taken from this. But it's something certainly that the incoming Trump administration will be, because they're saying it already, that this shows the seriousness, the validity, how effective American foreign policy can be when the gloves come off.
In an article published in the past week or so, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported that U.S. and Israeli intelligence are concerned that the fall of Assad might incentivize Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. By the way, if that's true, one wonders why Israel and the U.S. did so much to remove Assad from power.
Right.
But let's put that aside for a moment. Right. Do you think these concerns are well-founded, that Iran will now say, because if I'm sitting in Iran's seat, I'm looking at this going, I'm next.
I don't. I mean, the things we've heard out of Iran over the last year about how there may be a change to the fatwa that denies Iran the ability to have weapons of mass destruction, because essentially this is a religious order in Iran that weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, are un-Islamic and they're not to be held by the Islamic Republic. But there's been, you hear coming out this last year that we may have to change that, and maybe the next supreme leader won't feel that way, and or circumstances will force us. And what those circumstances are, of course, are the pressure on Iran. So certainly the loss of an ally, and again, now we have this revisionism, maybe he wasn't that great of an ally, whatever. But the loss of Syria is a blow to Iran. It's a blow. They have their same. They have people in Tehran who look at the world in the same Brzezinski Kissinger manner that we do, or like it's a big game of Risk and what's color coded, your maps. They have people who look at that way as well. And I mean, certainly that's a blow to them. But the biggest thing that's forcing them to consider a nuclear weapon is the threat from Israel, backed by the United States, is the lack of parity. It's the fact that Israel has escalation dominance with its nuclear weapons. If anyone over the last 14 months do not think that Israel would use nuclear weapons, I don't know what to tell you. After seeing everything that they've done, if you don't think at some point, at some stage, and potentially even early on, Israel in a blowout with Iran would not utilize nuclear weapons, I don't know what to tell you. So certainly they're faced with that. I think that's the case with other nations as well, too, and the reason is seeing that ultimately, as we've seen escalation continually throughout the region, but also in other parts of the world. And the idea that that top rung of the ladder is the nuclear weapons, and we can't get to it. That everyone else, the other side has escalation dominance, we don't. That's a big motivating factor. But there's also, too, of course, the Gaddafi model, right? There's the Saddam Hussein model, that if you don't have these things to protect yourself, you could be next. So there is that argument that comes from Syria as well. Like I think that it's there, but they've known that for a long time. The biggest thing for the Iranians in terms of them feeling a nuclear weapon is because the other side has one, and they believe that the other side would actually use one. And not just the Israelis, but the Americans as well. And now we have coming into power, whereas with the Biden administration, you certainly had those in power who talked about things like usable nuclear weapons. Now, in the Trump administration, you certainly have those who believe in that. They believe in the technocratic aspects of it, the strategic or operational use of nuclear weapons, but they also believe in the righteousness of doing so. So I think for the Iranians, the arguments against having a nuclear weapon, aside from the fatwa, continue to diminish.
And finally, related to that, my question to you is Iran, in fact, next, based on, you mentioned that the Trump administration is likely to be buoyed by what has happened in Syria. This is an affirmation of Israel's hyper-aggressive behavior. From their perspective, Trump has surrounded himself with some extraordinarily hawkish people, like Marco Rubio, amongst others. And it's hard to believe that Trump is going to resist the obvious desire and demands of the Netanyahu regime that the head of the snake be cut off, as they put it.
Right.
What's your take on this? Do you think we have a realistic prospect of avoiding a full-blown war with Iran under a Trump administration?
I think we do, because these people who are coming in are so concerned about China. And they also, too, hold on to a vestige of concern about Russia, that they see Iran as tertiary. At the same time, too, there are others who are coming in who their first concern is Israel. So Iran now is their first concern. So there'll be a battle, I think, with the administration over who's the top bad guy. I think what they will decide to do, though, is they'll decide to continue to do what they've done before, only more. In a sense of that, I think they'll look at this and they'll look at success in Syria, and they'll say we need to use proxies. So they'll start funding the MEK again. Maybe they haven't stopped funding them. I don't know, but they'll try and do more coup-like, more internal bombings, more assassinations, more of what they've done before. They'll monkey around, they'll mess around with cyber, and hopefully you don't have a Stuxnet situation like we had before where it gets out. The sanctions, of course, they always find a way to, you always hear the sanctions are the most strenuous ever, and they find a way to ratchet that up. They'll do that. They'll interdict Iranian oil as they can. They may do a total blockade on Iran, stop all shipping. They'll do that on other guys too, because now with the loss of Syria, Iran to arm Hezbollah or support Hezbollah will have to do it primarily by sea. So they'll do it on other guys. But these are the things we saw a few years ago when Israel and Iran were seizing each other's ships for a bit. And what was that, 2021? I think you will have this wanting to bring it up to the edge, hoping that you have regime change in Iran through some color revolution like you've seen before, the constant pressure on the Iranian government by attacks on infrastructure, by attacks on personnel, by attacks on its forces, its proxies overseas, but or outside of Iran, and then the continual fantasy that somehow if we just do one more set of sanctions, the Iranian people are going to say, "That's it, I've had enough. Get these mullahs out of power," and then pushing it up to the line that we get the Iranians give the U.S. the permission to launch an attack on Iran. That something happens that allows the U.S. to launch airstrikes that would do significant damage to Iranian military infrastructure and forces. That's the great hope. And then, of course, that regime change is going to occur a la 2014 or 2024 now, 2014 in Ukraine, of course, but that somehow that this is the hope. And I think that's what we'll see with the Trump policy on Iran and everything, of course, through the focus of what's best for Israel. But I think what Iran has for it is the way that it demonstrated this past year, its deterrence capability. It can put ballistic missiles into Israel. And that's a real threat for the Israelis. And the Israelis, of course, don't want to go past that line then. So the best hope for the Israelis are if we get the Americans to do that so that the Iranians don't attack Israeli cities and infrastructure and forces with their ballistic missiles and allow the American Air Force and Navy to destroy the Iranian military capabilities for no other reason than just to destroy them, because that's not going to bring about regime change or collapse the Iranian government because we sunk 4 Iranian frigates or something like that. So I think that's so a long way of saying, Dimitri, that I think we're going to see more of the same.
Well, it sounds like one thing is certain, and that's that 2025 is going to be one hell of a year, Matthew.
Right. Yeah. And we're on this continuous path, right? I mean, so it's not like anything's going to end. The line, the trajectory we're on continues. The arrow keeps moving forward. Nobody that I know, maybe some people did, got Syria correct in terms of what would happen, but it falls into the larger understanding of what's occurring in the Middle East, and that there are these events and actions and occurrences that are reshaping the entire region, having a great effect on the world as well, and that are not just I don't want to say they're unpredictable, but they're uncontrollable. So if this what's occurring in Syria, this is just the beginning of this next phase for Syria that, God help the Syrian people.
I have to ask you one more question after hearing your those comments, and that is, what do you think is likely to happen? And I mean, we all, I think, can agree that Ukraine has lost this war. And although they're still able to put up significant resistance and they are inflicting casualties on the Russian forces are advancing inexorably towards the Dnieper. And, what do you think the Trump administration is most likely to do in terms of this war? Is it going to continue down this path of insisting upon a freeze and NATO membership for Ukraine eventually, which the Russians are never going to accept, right? I think? Or are they going to get, religion and face the fact that Ukraine can't enter NATO and Russia wants, those lands to be recognized as part of Russian sovereign territory?
Right. I think the real danger is that Trump wants this as a quick political victory, right? He wants to be in his first couple of months to be able to point to it and say, I did what Biden couldn't do. Now, interestingly, what Trump has said about how I'm going to go to Putin and say, if you don't negotiate, I'm going to give Ukraine so much it'll make your head explode, which is impossible because we just simply don't have much to give them. But, I think going to the Ukrainians and saying the same thing as well, if you don't negotiate, you're not going to get anything. That's essentially what Biden should have said 3 years ago. That's essentially what Biden should have said 3 years ago to both of them in the spirit of anyway, they're going to negotiate. And they tried to negotiate anyway, as we saw. And certainly that was never in the interest of the West West, of the Americans or the Brits or whatever. With the Trump administration, it's this interest of peace, but for political purposes. So Trump can stand up and say, I did what Biden couldn't do. And the danger is that the people he has brought in are all very serious hawks on this. I don't know of anyone he's brought in. Maybe there's one or two who actually have an idea of negotiations in Ukraine, not to just get some type of award for getting it done, but because it's necessary for stability and security going forward for Europe and for the world. I think the danger is that Trump administration is going to try and dictate to the Russians. We all know how the Russians are going to feel about being dictated to, particularly when they're in a position that they're in. The Americans and the Europeans, we just saw a $50 billion loan approved and be paid for by Russian assets, essentially. That's going to continue. The idea being that if we can keep Ukraine afloat, if we can just get them to send their 18-year-olds to this war, we can keep this going for another several years. And by that time, maybe the Russian economy will collapse. And just like in Iran, the people will rise up and they'll throw Vladimir Putin and his people out of power, right? I mean, that's the continual hope, if you will, in D.C., London, Brussels. I think if the Russians have the Russians are in a very difficult place, though. They are moving westward. The Ukrainian military is slowly collapsing in front of them. But the farther west the Russians go, the more territory they take that they never wanted to take. Right. So they become more of an occupying power. The further west they move, the more Ukrainian speakers they are coming under their control than Russian speakers. And now you have this idea of that you're being an occupying force, that you may have an insurgency as well as a front line. Plus, we've seen that the Americans will totally bankrupt ourselves for something like this. We spent $8 trillion on the Iraq and Afghan wars. Well, we have only spent $200 billion on this war so far. We've got a lot to go. So you have, right? I mean, you have that as well. Like, this is real. The United States will spend everything it has just to try and defeat us. And it's even better for them because it's not their men who are being thrown into this furnace. It's the Ukrainian men. And we've also seen the Americans and the Europeans, for that matter, say clearly that this is really good for us. We really like the fact that our weapons companies are making this much money. The politicians love it because the weapons companies love it. The banks love it. The fossil fuel companies absolutely love it. So all their friends are happy with this war. We just have to make sure we control it. And of course, we've got the people that can control this war. We're the masters of history now. We're the ones who make reality on and on and on, and that we can bring this up to the edge, that we can bring this up to the line without passing over. And we keep seeing this game of chicken that we're in, and we're all strapped into the seat, and we're a game of chicken with the Russians, that at some point it might go really badly. And so I think those are the concerns I have going forward. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that the Trump administration will approach the Russians in a more conciliatory and reasonable manner rather than dictating to them, that they will get some type of freeze so that these men and their families are not continuing to suffer on both sides, that the escalation diminishes, that we don't have this risk of World War III, right? I mean, all those would be very good things to achieve through a ceasefire and then negotiations. And hopefully both sides are willing to put the issue of NATO in the future, and both sides are wise enough to never address that issue ever again, just to continue to, and then hopefully, again, but everything I'm saying, Dimitri, right? It's all dominated by the word hope. And hope is not policy. Hope is not strategy, but that's where we're at right now.
I hope you're wrong. Anyways, it's a great pleasure. You've been very generous with your time, Matthew, and it's a great pleasure talking to you. And I look forward to another conversation in future, hopefully in better circumstances.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks, Dimitri.
Thank you. Take care. And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Montreal, Canada on December 12th, 2024.